When Lucia Pelaez was very small, she read a novel under the covers. She read it in fragments, night after night, hiding it under the pillow. She had stolen it from the cedar bookshelf where her uncle kept his favorite books. As the years passed, Lucia traveled far. In search of phantoms, she walked over the rocks in the Antioquia River, and in search of people, she walked the streets of the violent cities. Lucia walked a long way, and in the course of her travels was always accompanied by echoes of those distant voices she had heard with her eyes when she was small. Lucia has never read that book again. She would no longer recognize it. It has grown so much inside her that now it is something else. Now it is hers. One of the things that I admire most about Eduardo Galeano is his brevity, right? He understands the power of parable. You could call the Book of Embraces a collection of flash fiction just as easily as you could call it a novel or a collection of prose poetry. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been rereading this is that it takes a distinct kind of talent to be good at. It's probably oversimplified to say that flash fiction is somewhere in between a novel and poetry. What it feels more correct to say is that good flash fiction is like a good joke, even when the stories have no punchline. But Galeano doesn't just deal with jokes, he deals with myth and martyrdom and magical realism, the simple pleasures of life and love, oppression and redemption, and both the dignities and difficulties of living in what the poet Franz Wright once called the starry blue strangeness of being here at all. I can't sleep. There is a woman stuck between my eyelids. I would tell her to get out if I could, but there is a woman stuck in my throat. I discovered Galeano through Saul Williams' book-length poem, So the Shotgun to the Head, which I highly recommend. The quote that I just read served as one of the epigraphs for that poem, and I even included it in my first ever literary mixtape that I did all those years ago, before I had ever read the Book of Embraces. Originally, I read this quote as being about two different women, right? In that the speaker/narrator was expressing these powerful conflicting emotions that he felt for two different people. Now, though, I've reread it with the assumption that the woman in the eyelids and the woman in the throat is the same person. I don't know what it says about me that I initially read it as being about two different women. Perhaps that's the correct reading. Perhaps there is no correct reading. But in either case, I enjoy the expression of the pure power of love's obsession that is presented so nakedly and so quickly here. The sense that your body is being invaded and being taken over by your beloved rings so poetic. Something about the attempt to forget someone, and by that attempt of forgetting, you are reminded of them even more. People linger in your body long after they're gone. Galeano's so good at expressing those simple, elemental, and yet paradoxical elements of human existence, and he does so without condemnation. The TV hurls out images that reproduce the system in voices that echo it, and there is no spot on Earth it does not reach. The entire planet is a huge suburb of Dallas. We eat imported emotions as if they were canned sausages, while the young children of television, trained to watch life instead of making it, shrug their shoulders. In Latin America, freedom of expression consists of the right to protest on a few radio stations and in local newspapers. It has become unnecessary for the police to ban books. Their price alone bans them. He also has this ability to produce things that end up feeling simultaneously universal and also weirdly and deeply personal. And it's that intimacy that's able to define his sense of social justice without being merely political. Galeano was a journalist, originally from Uruguay, and in 1973 he published a 500-page historical treatise called Open Veins of Latin America, 5 centuries of the pillage of a continent. In that same year, a military dictatorship came to power in Uruguay, and he was briefly imprisoned and then forced to flee to Argentina. He lived there for 3 years until a military dictatorship came to power there, and his name was on the death squad list, and so that forced him to flee yet again, this time to Spain, which had only a year prior come out of the Francoist regime. And I think that geopolitical fragility allows me to cherish the fact that he was able to write so much and for so long. Honestly, he should have been dead before his fiction career ever began. When the curtain fell each night, Patricia Ariza, marked for death, would close her eyes and silently give thanks for that night's applause and for having cheated death out of one more day of life. Patricia was on death list for thinking in red and living in red, and the sentences were becoming implacably carried out, one by one. Finally, she was homeless. Worried that their building would be blown up, her neighbors, obeying the law of fear, demanded that she leave. She walked the streets of Bogota wearing a bulletproof vest. The vest was ugly and depressing, but she had no choice. One day, Patricia sewed some sequins onto it. Another day, she embroidered it with colorful flowers, a rain of flowers over her breasts. And so, bit by bit, she embellished the vest, making it more and more cheerful, for like it or not, she was beginning to wear it wherever she went, even on stage. When Patricia left Colombia to perform in Europe, she offered the vest to a peasant named Julio Queñón. Julio Queñón, mayor of the town of Vista Hermosa, had seen his whole family murdered as a warning, but he refused to wear the flowery vest. "I don't wear women's clothing," he said. With scissors, Patricia stripped the vest of its glitter and color. Then the man accepted her offer. He was gunned down that night, wearing the vest. Because he was a journalist, so many of his stories weren't his own, but the stories that he gives us are ones that we would never otherwise hear. Pieces like the one I just read are heartbreaking, of course, but one gets the sense that we should be glad to have the heartbreak, that after such ignominious ends for so many people, the last and best dignity that we can give them is to remember them. Author's note. Cedric Belfridge died shortly after finishing his translation of my work, The Book of Embraces. We had already worked together for many years. Each one of his translations increased our certitude of mutual identification. I would recognize myself in each of his translations, and he would feel betrayed and annoyed whenever I didn't write something the way he would have. A part of me died with him. A part of him lives with me. There's a whole diffusion of authorship going on when you read a translated text. And then in this book, you flip to the page before and you read Translator's Acknowledgement. Within days of embarking on this noble project, a series of disabling traumas threatened its completion, which was then made possible by my friend and neighbor, the young translator Mark Schaefer. For so generously sharing his skills and patience, I owe him eternal thanks. And so, okay, there are two translators, plus the original author, who's primarily remixing other people's stories into one another, be it history or folk tales or anecdotes. Authorship is a collective act in the Book of Embraces. We write our stories together. We become more human together. That old African concept, Ubuntu. My humanity is bound up in your humanity. And that's ultimately what feels so powerful about this novel, is that it offers us the chance to become more human with the panoply of people that brought it into being. Their hands were tied or handcuffed, yet their fingers danced, flew, drew words. The prisoners were hooded, but leaning back, they could see a bit, just a bit, down below. Although it was forbidden to speak, they spoke with their hands. Pinio Ungerfeld taught me the finger alphabet, which he had learned in prison without a teacher. "Some of us had bad handwriting," he told me. "Others were masters of calligraphy." The Uruguayan dictatorship wanted everyone to stand alone, everyone to be no one. In prisons and barracks and throughout the country, communication was a crime. Some prisoners spent more than 10 years buried in solitary cells the size of coffins, hearing nothing but clanging bars or footsteps in the corridors. Fernandez Huidobro and Mauricio Rosenkopf, thus condemned, survived because they could talk to each other by tapping on the wall. In that way, they told of dreams and memories, fallings in and out of love. They discussed, embraced, fought. They shared beliefs and beauties, doubts and guilts, and those questions that have no answer. When it is genuine, when it is born of the need to speak, No one can stop the human voice. When denied a mouth, it speaks with the hands, or the eyes, or the pores, or anything at all, because every single one of us has something to say to the others. Something that deserves to be celebrated or forgiven by others.